top nonfiction authors about their latest work.
David Frum, good to be with you.
Thank you so much.
I must say, I like the title of your book very much. It seems fitting that a president who's so brand conscious and likes to see his name on hotels and golf courses and steaks would also get his own brand name regime type with Trumpocracy. So with that in mind, can you define Trumpocracy and explain how you came up with this concept?
Well, we are all mesmerized by Donald Trump's outsized personality. And it's natural to believe that the personality is the secret to what is going on. Trumpocracy, which comes from the same root as democracy and autocracy, is a book about the study of power. That's what the suffix means. This is the study of Donald Trump's power. How did he get it? How does he maintain it? How does he get away with it? So Trumpocracy is the system of enabling. It's the system in the White House. It's the system between Trump and Congress. It's the system between Trump and the media that enable him and create an audience. It's the system that involves the Republican donor elite, the traditional elements of the Republican Party that have succumbed to him, and above all, between him and that core group of his voters within the Republican Party who enabled him to win the Republican nomination and then go on to the presidency.
Now, there have been bad presidents in American history. There have been even borderline destructive presidents in American history. When did you decide that Trump sort of transcended this and posed a threat to the American system of democracy itself?
My concern is only secondarily with Donald Trump. It is with this larger system. So what I became concerned by, and when I started writing about this, was years before Donald Trump was even thought of as a candidate for president. My interest in repressive populism really intensified in the early part of the 2000s, as I started covering the Tea Party movement and writing a lot about that. It was plain to me that the ideological extremism of the regular Republican Party, which was so plutocratic, so indifferent to what America was going through, the terrible recession, what was happening to middle-class incomes, what was happening to middle-class savings, the first origins of the accelerating drug crisis, which you could already see shaping up a decade ago, was opening space for something dangerous. And then you could see this dangerous thing taking form first in Europe, happened in France and in the countries of southeastern Europe, Hungary and Poland. And I became morbidly obsessed that such a thing was possible in the United States, that it was coming. And I didn't know it would be Donald Trump. In fact, I was quite surprised. But when he showed up, I realized this is what we've been waiting for.
I'm glad you raised that. There's these two sort of threads running through the book, right? One is about just the stuff that Trump is doing, right? And you also write, though, about these pre-existing vulnerabilities that Trump sort of very sagely identified and exploited. So when you're looking at the challenges to American democracy today under the Trump presidency, how much are you worried about the man and the family, and how much is it more institutional and systemic?
When you're well and healthy, you shake off infections that can kill you if you're not well and healthy. There are circumstances where a Donald Trump or somebody like him could have fluked into office in the way that Donald Trump fluked office. And then the American system, a healthy American system of government, would stop him. Let me give you a very concrete example of what I mean. Right now, Donald Trump is receiving millions of dollars in payments from foreign business partners. In the Philippines, in Turkey, in the United Arab Emirates, India. We don't know how much. We don't know whether it's a flat fee or whether he's getting percentages. We have no idea. What we do know is it seems to be affecting American foreign policy, because the countries from which he draws these incomes, the Philippines and Turkey, seem to get much easier treatment from him than the countries from which he does not. The most extreme example of this is in the Persian Gulf, where Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, that have been good business partners to the Trump family, get one treatment, and Qatar, which not only didn't have its National Day in the Trump Hotel, but which actually canceled a lease in the Trump Tower in 2014, they get a different. It's obviously affecting American foreign policy. You can imagine in a healthier society that Congress would do something about this. Jimmy Carter faced an all-Democratic Congress. Bill Clinton, in his first 2 years, faced an all-Democratic Congress. They held those presidents accountable. This Congress does not. And the complicity between Trump and the Republican Congress, That's the first building block of this Trumpocracy.
There are different schools of thought among Trump critics about the threats that this presidency is posing. There are some who worry about the authoritarian tendencies that are emerging. Others who see more of sort of a chaos theory that it's amateur hour in the White House. And then others just worry about the unpredictability of Trump. This is the Hillary Clinton criticism that, if you can bait a man with a tweet, et cetera. Obviously these things can overlap, but after sort of year one of Trump, is there one of these tendencies that tends to worry you most?
Donald Trump is negligent and indifferent to everything that a president properly should do. But he's quite active, committed, and wily about the things the president should not do. So there's truth to all of these points. I mean, there is chaos because Donald Trump cannot abide any restraint, even the kind of restraint that is in his own self-interest. Dramatic example of this, story I tell in the book. And by the way, I want to make clear when I say a story, these things are all reported by other people. And I'm very dependent on and grateful to the reporting of others. One of the things I tried to do in the book was always to pay credit not just to the institution, but to the individual reporter. Although this has become a challenge, because one of the innovations of the Trump years, pioneered by your paper, is because the president denies everything, the paper started quoting 42 sources on a story. So that means you get byline, not just the double-barreled byline, which was a big deal in the past, but three-barreled and even four-barreled bylines, and that poses a bit of a challenge.
The Washington Post thanks you for giving credit to individual reporters.
But people do amazing work. So here's the story. When H.R. McMaster replaces Michael Flynn as National Security Advisor, one of the first things he sets out to do is to reaffirm the American commitment to NATO. Trump has made a lot of noises that are very nervous about how much he dislikes NATO, and of course he's so much under Russian influence or worse. It's a big problem. So McMaster arranges for Trump to pay a visit to NATO headquarters in Brussels. He will give a speech standing in front of the monument to Article 5, a twisted girder from the World Trade Center. And there, in front of that, at NATO headquarters, in front of that monument, he will read a full-throated, no-compromise commitment to the Mutual Defense Treaty. And to be sure that Trump says the right things, McMaster writes the passage himself, or at least oversees the writing with the writer. And it's in the speech. On the way to Europe, McMaster briefs reporters. This is what the president is going to say. Trump gets to that portion of the speech, and he skips the key passage. Why? Ideological hostility to NATO, some pressure from the Russians, or maybe he just doesn't like being told what to do. We don't know. But that's where you see the consequence, because what then has to happen, of course, is McMaster now is in the situation where everyone expected this endorsement. And the question is, wow, is the president reneging? Is the United States reneging? And McMaster has to brief reporters. I don't know what you're talking about. The president did exactly what everybody expected. So you get the chaos you get the necessity to lie, you get the breaking of the White House staff, the discrediting of McMaster in the eyes of the press, one of the most honorable soldiers of his generation. So I think these things come together. But I would emphasize Donald Trump is driven above all by greed and by the desire for dominance. Very, very little by ideology.
Could someone else have stepped in to do this, right? Is Trumpocracy only possible with Donald Trump? Could someone else, do you think, have, in as skillfully a manner exploited these vulnerabilities that you identified?
Somebody will. And because one of the things we need to understand, this is going on throughout the Western world. We are seeing a global decline in confidence in democracy, belief in democracy, and the effectiveness of democracy across the democratic world. And in the United States, it happened to express itself in the more right-leaning party. But in other countries, it has expressed itself in the more left-leaning parties. I mean, a lot of the forces behind Donald Trump you see in Spain and in Greece and parties of the left, in Italy, in England, in Britain, in the candidacy of Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour Party. And many of the things that worry me show up inside. I mean, the Democratic Party has been a more level-headed party in recent years than the Republican Party. But one of the themes I stress in the book that is back of this at the most fundamental level are racial, sexual, and economic tensions.
Mm-hmm.
And the sexual tensions I draw special attention to. If you follow the Bernie Sanders versus Hillary Clinton primaries, the gender gap between Sanders voters and Clinton voters was bigger than the gender gap in the general election between Trump supporters and Clinton supporters. And a lot of the things that were unleashed in social media in that were as or more misogynistic than the themes that were unleashed. And you have a lot of disaffected men, a lot of isolated women, and that is one of the sources of energy for these anti-democratic movements.
In the book, you spend some time on the conventional notions of why Trump did or didn't win in 2016. You're not entirely persuaded by the white working class theory of the case, for instance. What are the things you think that we least understand about what propelled him to power?
First, you have to pay attention more to the nomination than, because that was the freakish thing. You know, once you're one of the two most likely people on earth to be the president of the United States,
you got a shot, right?
Right. So, and a lot of that was a lucky bounce. In the general election, also, the real question is not about Donald Trump; it's about Hillary Clinton, because Barack Obama in the fall of 2016 was polling well above 50%. The economy was growing. Personal incomes were rising. Political scientists would tell you the party of the president should, I don't need to, doesn't matter, Republican, Democrat, don't tell me their names. I'm looking at these numbers. The party of the president should win a third term. Certainly should, and so when Hillary Clinton got 48 point something, such a big gap between her performance and Obama's, that's the first thing that needs to be explained. Voter suppression is indeed part of the story, but there's more to it than that. Her weakness enabled then Trump's lucky bounce, the aid from the Russians, the Comey thing, to have their impact. But if she had been stronger, she should have been able to resist those things. But the battle for the nomination, that's the mesmerizing thing. Ms. Trump should not have won that. What ought to have happened is Jeb Bush campaigned as Paul Ryan plus more immigration. You know, the Republican, and so he was set up, that bubble was set up to pop. If you went to these Tea Party rallies, you saw what the Republican base was signaling is we want more health care, less immigration, no more Bushes. And what they were offered and said was less health care, more immigration, and one more Bush. So he was vulnerable. The question is, why didn't some more normal political actor, Scott Walker, something like that,
who was a very brief front runner.
Okay, and yeah, okay, not the world's most charismatic guy, but he had a story. He had a story. Or somebody else. Why didn't somebody else intuit these themes that Donald Trump was intuiting? That Republican voters want Medicare protected, not dismantled. They want less immigration, not more. That they are going to need their Social Security. Why didn't such a person take those themes and then deploy them and be the one to lay Jeb Bush low? And that is part of the story of the preconditions that enable Trump is the ideological rigidity of a Republican Party, that even when the $50 bill is lying on the sidewalk in front of you, you cannot pick it up. Because it just can't be there. It's not possible that it can be there.
In fact, they had written a whole autopsy report after 2012 explaining why.
All of it written by people with one connection or another to the Jeb. They wrote a Help Wanted ad with Jeb Bush in mind. The fix was in, but a shrewder political character should have been able to see, this is terrible advice, this report, because the report said, I mean, I start the book by talking about, early in the book, the 2012 election, how within 72 hours, the entire Republican Party has converged on the message, change nothing. You know, voted for Mitt Romney, believe in Mitt Romney, I think he would have been a fabulous president. But the party sent him to campaign on a platform that included gradually withdrawing the Medicare guarantee from everyone under 55. I mean, it's amazing he got 47% of the vote. I think he only got as much as that because people did not understand what the Republicans were promising to do to their own voters. You might have thought that the reaction to after the vote was, we need to be a little less dismissive of people who work for wages. We need to be more attentive to the fact that even our voters really like Medicare and want it to be available even to those who are now under 55. They couldn't see that. They could only see the part of the Romney platform they did not like, which was his moderately tough line on immigration. They didn't like that. Let's jettison that and make it a 100% rich person platform.
It's, as you say, it's easy to fixate on Trump, right? he's on the title of your book. It's the classic overcoat shot that book publishers love these days. Yet you write in the introduction that this book is not the story of Trump, or not just the story of Trump. It's the story of those who enable, empower, support, and collaborate with Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. Who are they? Who are the enablers? How do you break them down?
Let's start with concentric circles. First, there are those who immediately serve him, who lie for him. And often for understandable or even noble reasons, like H.R. McMaster, lying to conceal the fact the President of the United States does not want to honor the NATO treaty. They are the larger executive branch, not outside the White House, the Department of Justice and the FBI, staffed with people who are like Rod Rosenstein. Puzzle. They've never seen it, like a Rod Rosenstein who seems like a conscientious and not very imaginative person, struggling to do the right thing while also mollifying the president, trying to walk the line, and not understanding what a spirit of destruction and what he's negotiating with, how implacable. So a lot of people are baffled by this in the executive branch. The people in the FBI as well, trying to follow their traditional rules in the face of a president who's unlike anything else. Then we widen it some more, and it's the Republicans in Congress who are not doing their job, not insisting on basic things like if the President of the United States is on the payroll of foreign business people, the country needs to know about that. Then it's the Republican donor elite that believed they could use him and didn't understand that he would use them. And in fact, didn't understand that their idea made them hostages. Normally what happens in the first year of a presidency is the president has an agenda, wants to accomplish things, and he's surrounded by people with human weaknesses. And so, you've seen it, it's in the LBJ movies. The president wants a civil rights bill, the member of the House of Representatives wants a dam, and the deal is done. This is the other way around, that Paul Ryan has the agenda, and Donald Trump is the person of all the human weaknesses. So they are the enablers. Those donors who believe that this guy would be the vehicle for achieving what they wanted, and the price would be something bearable. And finally, the enablers are, there's one more step. The enablers are the conservative intellectual world, which developed a series of rationalizations and justifications and excuses. If they can't defend him, they attack his opponents. If they can't convincingly attack his opponents, they change the subject. If they can't change the subject, then they just go quiet altogether. And lastly, there are, in the country, these Americans who are, in their millions, drawn to a radical politics of authoritarianism as a way of achieving what things they want to achieve and then punishing people whom they want to punish.
There's a lot to unpack there. Let's start with the party a little bit. You write that once in office, it was not Trump's own cunning that enabled him to defy long-established standards of decent behavior. It was the complicity of his allies in the Republican Party, and that the once great party has united to elevate one man into a position of almost absolute power over itself. Clearly, the Republican Party, the Republican establishment thought they were getting something out of this deal. What have they gotten beyond a tax bill out of this deal?
They've gotten the tax bill. They've gotten substantial deconstruction of a lot of Obama-era environmental regulations. They're looking forward to more of those. As Obama left behind, because he couldn't pass legislative restrictions on carbon emissions, he left behind a very elaborate EPA scheme for regulating carbon. And like EPA, it's intrusive and burdensome and often irrational. And a big project of the coming year will be shutting that down. They got relief from some of the parts of Obamacare and some hope that although Obamacare couldn't be repealed, maybe it could be damaged enough to collapse. They get important favors for the financial industry, and above all, the breaking of the Consumer Finance Protection Board that has just been dismantled. Donald Trump has his own OMB director serving at the same time as the director of the Consumer Protection Board, paralyzing that body. So I think that
Neil Gorsuch, right?
They got Neil Gorsuch. That's probably more important to the rank and file than to the donor elite. But they're happy about that. So they're getting stuff. They're getting real substantial, tangible benefits. One of the things that and this corporate income tax, let's not minimize how big a deal that is. One of the arguments, it's long been argued by economists, who pays the corporate income tax? Is it paid by workers? Is it paid by consumers? Or is it paid by shareholders? So we now have an answer to that question. When the stock market goes up 30% on the expectation of a corporate income tax cut, the stock market is saying, we think the shareholders are getting most of this. Because if it were going to workers and customers, then the stock market shouldn't have reacted to it at all.
You write that Trump has ripped out the conscience of half of the political spectrum and left a moral void where American conservatism once was. Did Trump do that, or...
They were so ready.
When did that excavation of the moral conscience of the Republicans begin? I mean, you've been an in-house critic of the party for a while throughout the Obama years. Your former colleague at AEI, Norm Ornstein, wrote a book several years ago about what he viewed as a kind of moral bankruptcy of the party already. When did this begin?
The trend begins, I think, in reaction to disappointment with the Bush presidency in which I served, reaction against the economic disappointments in the Iraq War, of which I was a supporter, and the party began to move in a more radical direction. When I say radical, toward economic individualism, toward a more plutocratic politics, at exactly the same time that the American middle class, from which the Republican Party had historically drawn its strength, was getting into bigger and bigger trouble. And especially white America, from which the Republican Party, again, has disproportionately drawn its strength, was getting into particularly big trouble with diseases and addiction. So that the party had moved away from its voters. And that's the beginning. That's the beginning of the rotten. And the book opens with a series of sort of the steps down which the American political system is tumbling. And although this is primarily a Republican story, I think it's true of both parties that since the end of the Cold War, they've been playing the political game much more ruthlessly than they did between 1945 and 1990. That's again one of the themes of the book. Is I don't think we understood at the time how much the Cold War limited what the parties did to each other, because the country was in a deadly lethal great power competition, depended on presidential leadership, and so the president had to be respected, the president had to be respectable, and the parties had to set some limits on what they did to each other in order to ensure that the president could lead in this deadly struggle. With the struggle behind us, the party competition has become much more savage, and the president has become a person it's much less necessary to respect and much more just an ordinary party leader.
This is the mutual toleration norm, right? The political scientists talk about between the parties. Now, you write also that during this first year of Trump, so much of the attention has been on the president's bullying or raging or his tweets and unpredictability. But you say the most radical attack on American norms of governance in his first year were attempted by the regular Republicans in the House and in the Senate.
Right.
What were those most radical attacks?
Well, they undertook two gigantically expensive pieces of legislation, this huge tax cut and the repeal of Obamacare and the replacement with a new kind of medical system. Details to be filled in later. And they did all of this without hearings of any kind, and with the costs and benefits produced at the very last minute in ways that really were not well done. And that was especially true of the tax bill. To this day, no one knows what the true fiscal cost of this bill is going to be, because the bill creates so many possibilities for arbitrage and gamesmanship. I mean, that you have to estimate, well, how many people really are going to take advantage of these new pass-through LLCs? They're so complicated. The regs haven't been written yet. You don't know the answer to that question. So you don't know how much individual income tax you're going to lose from high-income taxpayers. But so the country was invited to buy a pig in the poke twice, without hearings, without opponents of the legislation getting a chance to be heard and to present expert witnesses of what this would mean. That's a real departure. Big pieces of legislation. I mean, again, we've been getting hastier. Obamacare passed more hastily than major pieces of legislation in the past. But I mean, Obamacare was a model of legislative procedure compared to what happened after 2017.
I want to talk a little about the people around Trump and the administration and in the White House. There were those very early on who signed public letters stating their opposition to Trump especially in the national security realm. And they were the true believers who were with Trump from the beginning. And then you've had those who have sort of made their peace about serving in this White House or this administration, perhaps even as an effort to protect against the excesses of the president. You talk about them in the book. You say that when good people do bad things, they usually have good reasons. What role do these people play in Trumpocracy? I'm talking about people like H.R. McMaster, like Jim Mattis. Will we look back on them as enablers or as like a last line of defense?
Well, for many of them, the situation will be quite tragic. So Jim Mattis has the advantage. He's across the river.
Yes.
He's in a giant bureaucracy that has tremendous power of its own. And he's a 4-star general. McMaster's just a 3-star, which to you or me doesn't mean much. But within their universe, that is an overwhelming difference. He's a man at the end of his career with nothing more that he needs to accomplish.
Talking about Mattis.
Mattis.
Yeah.
And in fact is sacrificing. He's sacrificing the rewards of peaceful life with his family and friends that he has abundantly earned in order to be there. He also knows that he cannot be fired. That would be a conflagration if he were fired, and if fired, he can't be replaced because the replacement would have to go through a Senate confirmation hearing. So somebody like that can be a real check, and I think Mattis has been, to the point where Mattis has actually been able to, in various ways, make clear how little regard he has for Donald Trump. I mean, at that
the transgender ban, for instance.
But at the remember that North Korean self-abasement session. So watch it, Mattis.
He doesn't
do it. He has this. This came into the public domain by accident with that speech he gave to soldiers in Jordan, where he's talking to a group of a couple of dozen soldiers, and somebody videos him and posted on YouTube, in which he begins by saying, I don't have to tell you, my fine young soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, that our country isn't what it should be right now, that the days, we have to get back to being more respectful to one another, kinder to one another, and until that happens, I'm asking you just to hold the line. So that's a pretty searing critique.
And it sounds like a description of what he's doing.
It sounds like what he's doing. But other people have less immunity. They're, if you're on the same side of the river as the president, if you're in the same building as the president, if you're fireable by the president, if your successor does not need to be Senate confirmed, and if you want things from the president, that alters it. So I quote in the book an exchange I'd had with my good friend Elliot Cohen, who went through a lot of, a great military expert, great expert on national defense, and he went through a lot of wrestling with himself about the advice to give friends. And at first he said, you should serve, and then later he changed his mind. And when in this dialogue with him, said that, okay, my advice, if I asked this question, was to those considering this, you need to consider the role, whether you're directly serving the president or whether you're serving the national security. And then you need to know yourself and to know how sure am I that if asked to do something wrong, I will say no. And the final reflection is, and once you're sure that you will do the right thing, consider this. If the president agreed with you, would he have given you the job in the first place?
I guess it's too early, perhaps, to discern in what buckets or what categories some of these different participants fall in.
We can see the outstanding bad actors. We can already see them. We can see some of the good actors. And then it's complicated. Some people are good in some ways and bad in other ways. Like Rex Tillerson is proving, I think, to be a disastrous Secretary of State. But he is also proving to be non-enabler of Donald Trump. That he is, and so that's a complicated verdict.
Mm-hmm. There's also a risk, another risk you identify to this role, right? You warn in the book that Trump's disregard for long-held norms of democratic behavior may pressure others to, in turn, disregard their own long-held norms of behavior. In particular, you worry that the military, whether it's active duty generals, retired generals who are serving the administration, could be tempted to expand their role and to be less deferential to civilian control. Do you still worry about that? Do you see any signs of that materializing?
Thank you for bringing this up. This is one of the most, I think, one of the things that worries me most. It's not tended to get as much discussion as other things in the book. I call this the autoimmune disorders of Trump. The system in self-defense does things that are bad. I mean, my joke about this, it's 7 days in May, only with the generals as the good guys. So So
I've seen that. I've seen that movie.
So obviously, if Jim Mattis were president right now, I think the whole country would be happier. But the fact is, Jim Mattis is not president. He's in the chain of command. He has to execute the president's orders. And if the way the country is going to protect itself from Donald Trump is by military escaping civilian control, that's very dangerous. And it's happening in lots of ways that one senses, but we can't be sure of. For example, President Trump allows 14 people to read the president's daily intelligence brief. Normal administrations allow 3, 4, 5, 6. Normally it would be the vice president, national security advisor, the chief of staff. Basically, that's it. Bill Clinton let Hillary Clinton read it. But it's basically that group of people. And that's a few enough people and high enough people really to be able to hold important secrets. Trump lets 14 people, including his highly ethically compromised son-in-law, read it. And of course we know about his blurting crucial secrets to the Russian ambassadors, either because he wants just to show off or for some more sinister reason. So if you're the people in charge of these secrets, and you know the president isn't very curious, he gets most of his news from Fox and Friends anyway, how informative, I wonder, is the president's daily brief today compared to what it was like 2 years ago or 8 years ago? Information begins to stop flowing. And maybe you get sort of a wink and a nod permission from the McMaster. You don't have to tell the president, if he asks you a question, you can't lie. He never asks questions. Just anything sensitive, leave it out. And what we see is, the generals getting a lot of operational authority. Remember the mother of all bombs, that giant. The president was very proud to tell us that the theater commander made that decision all by himself. Well, theater commanders are getting into the habit of making a lot of decisions all by themselves.
It's hard to undo those habits.
Hard to undo those habits, especially if you consider what is happening to the Democratic Party. I mean, that it might be if you have 4 years of Donald Trump, and then Donald Trump is replaced by some George H.W. Bush figure, widely respected in the national security bureaucracy and very well informed about the national. That next president, he or she, may be able to pull the power of the president back together. But what if that next person is as much an outlier on the Democratic side as Donald Trump is on the Republican side? What if Donald Trump has 2 terms? Bureaucracies always want to slip the leash. Military bureaucracies always mistrust civilians. Remember Chief of Staff John Kelly's outburst about his contempt, real contempt for civilian authority.
If you have not served, you have no right to ask me questions.
Yeah. I mean, could there be a more un-American sentence than that? That's exactly who has the right to ask the questions. Your civilian masters for whom you work.
You've said, and right now I don't recall if this is in an interview or in the book, that when Trump first came along, you described yourself as sort of vaguely Trump curious.
Yes.
Right? You felt that he could sort of shake up what had become a very hidebound party. You didn't think he would win, right? But you thought he could be salutary for the Republican Party to rethink some of its policies and verities. Now that you've seen sort of the symbiosis between Donald Trump and the Republican Party, what happens to this party after Trump?
It has 3 futures. At least I can see 3 future paths for it. And they'll depend on events. The best case scenario is there is a decisive electoral lesson at the same time as local electorates reject the attempt to make voting more difficult that we're seeing spreading across so much of the country. There is a sharp lesson, and a sharp lesson that non-democratic methods are not going to be acceptable. And the party then evolves to be a more normal right-of-center party of enterprise and business, like the British Conservatives, the Canadian Conservatives, the German Christian Democrats, parties you see all over, the Australian Liberals, that says, we accept the rules of the game, we accept the social insurance state as it was built in the 30 years after World War II, and within that context, we're speaking up for people, savers and people who own businesses and private sector people, and not because the others are illegitimate or not American, but because they've got a party of theirs. Okay. And because a lot of what democracy is about is there are some questions where you have to do it one way or the other, and the way you do it is by putting up hands and taking a tally. Whoever has the more hands gets to do it his or her way. That's the most optimistic scenario. It's also possible, though, the party remains wedded to the plutocratic agenda of the Ryan years, and the defeats aren't so bad. And the Trump solution looks workable. The disenfranchisement solution looks like it's workable. And
you mean like voter suppression?
Voter suppression. Okay. One of the things when I wrote this book, there are some people I was in dialogue with or argument with. One of the things I was arguing against, when Donald Trump was elected and sworn in, there's a great spasm of, oh my God, this is like January 1933 in Germany. And what I want to show is that's not what modern authoritarianism is. You can't look at the most spectacular, most hideous case of democratic breakdown in all of political history, in the most extreme circumstances of hyperinflation and unemployment and famine and near civil war, say that's us. That's not how it's going to happen. The whole point to modern authoritarianism, where you see it in the Philippines, in South Africa, and India, is it's much more economical. That you can if you can identify the right 6% of the population and stop them from voting, that's just as good or better than canceling the election altogether. You get just as much power and with a lot less squawking.
And the legitimacy.
The legitimacy. Right. And it turns out you don't have to disqualify very many people. And you don't even have to tell anybody, you don't have to tell yourself what you're doing. You can do it without telling yourself.
There's a book out at the same time as yours, and I think of it as sort of in dialogue with your book. It's called How Democracies Die by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. And they discuss that, and they basically say the most likely scenario is that think of the United States like it all becomes kind of North Carolina.
Yes.
Right? Where you've seen a lot of moves toward this kind of behavior.
Yes.
How sort of simpatico do you think the GOP is to that kind of scenario?
I think that is a very possible scenario. Ziblatt's previous book was a huge influence on my thinking in this, and I'm going to recommend it to real hardcore history people because it is a toothy book. But his central thesis in that book, he compares the comparison of European democracies in the 19th century, is that a lot of the success of democracy, and Ziblatt speaks here as a man of the left, is their ability to reassure holders of wealth and power that democracy will not be too much of a threat to their interests. That if you have too radical a democracy, and this is something I say in the book, is that I quote this saying, you've seen it on the internet, your uncles probably sent it to you, but a democracy can only last until the majority learns it can vote itself benefits from the public treasury. Don Trump Jr. sent this around. This sentiment is attributed to a lot of people, Alexis de Tocqueville sometimes, Aristotle other times, some Scottish history. It seems as best as anybody can tell to have come from an op-ed in the Daily Oklahoman in the 1950s by a retired state legislator. But wherever it comes from, it's the opposite of the truth. That where democracies get into trouble, and leaving aside the extreme scenarios of the 1930s, is when people who possess assets become convinced that letting everybody vote means they will lose those assets. And the way where democracy survives is where people with assets become convinced that the small price that they will have to pay to keep their assets is worth it because of the greater stability of a democratic system. And what is happening in the United States right now is that asset holders are freaked out. Obama freaked the recession freaked them out. Obama freaked them out. They thought, my God, this Kenyan Muslim is going to take everything from me and leave me just like a few $100 billion to rub together in my pants. And in order to defend what they had, they became open to more radical solutions.
In your concentric circles of the enablers, you talked about sort of conservative intellectuals who kind of accommodated themselves to Trump. What has the rise of Donald Trump done to conservative thought. There's a recent essay in the Washington Post magazine that says that there's this kind of revitalization of conservative publications, and that the periods of alienation from power are when creative political thought seems to thrive. Do you see that happening among perhaps the conservative intellectuals who have not made their peace with Donald Trump?
I think that could happen. I hope it will. I don't see any sign that it's happened yet. Because we're still at the point where people are being given the moral acid test. And I am impressed and grateful at how many people are, and including some people I wouldn't have expected, are sort of shining in this moment and are standing up. So that's exciting. Others less so. I mean, I reference in the book the famous Never Trump issue of National Review. 24 people signed it, but about half of those 24 people have made their explicit peace with Donald Trump, and in some cases quite abjectly so. Brent Bozell of the Media Research Center, who went from signing that issue to being one of Trump's most ferocious defenders and one of the fiercest critics of those conservatives who do not go along with Donald Trump, or who were where he was at the time of the election. But the intellectual project, no, I don't see any signs of vitality there. And partly because I don't think American conservatives yet understand how out of date their ideas are, how much they were solutions to problems from one period of history, one set of circumstances, and how radically those conditions have changed. And let me put this very concretely. I mean, this is my life story. I apply this to myself as much as to others. So the conservatism I grew up with in the 1970s and 80s, that if you have an inflation, we know just what to do. And the liberals say it's wage and price controls. We know it's monetary restraint and deregulation. We know what to do. If you have a challenge from a totalitarian ideological geopolitical enemy, we know what to do. If you have a lot of crime, we know what to do. But if you have deflation and economic stagnation, if you have international chaos and the breakdown of the U.S.-led international order, if you have a drug epidemic and not a crime epidemic, then we're a little baffled. And so we respond to all this by insisting that America suffers from the problems we do know how to solve and does not suffer from the problems we do not know how to solve. And the real revitalization of conservatives begins when conservatives can acknowledge new problems, can say that certain principles and values may endure, but your policy, you can't fetishize policy solutions. And that work I don't see that work being done. But I want to say that in the context of paying tribute to the people who are quoted in that Washington Post article. And I think they've shown themselves people of character. And that should always be hailed and saluted.
There's a passage you have in the book that I wanted to ask you about because I wasn't entirely clear where it was headed. And you say, maybe you don't care about the future of the Republican Party, but you should. Conservatives will always be with us. If conservatives become convinced they cannot win democratically, they will not abandon conservatism. They will reject democracy.
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, that's what we were just talking about a minute ago with the greater North Carolina. That they will become. That you will see is more and more people saying explicitly what many Republican members of the House have said, which is, I don't think everybody should vote. I think voting should be difficult. You should have to make an effort. You shouldn't be able to just. It shouldn't be just anybody walking in off the street. I mean, the theory of democracy. Is most pungently expressed in a series of debates during the English Civil War 400 years ago, which is the poorest he has a life to live just as much as the greatest he. And that's the idea of democracy is, people are not equal in wisdom or aptitude or wealth, but from the point of view of the meaning of their own lives and their human worth, they are all equal. In that respect, we are all one. And the democratic theory says that one voice from that one person about his or her own life is entitled to equal consideration. If you start saying, well, but not if they're late, not if they can't get off work on a Tuesday, then you're discarding them. And then you can build a lot of rationalizations as to why it's so. And look, and some of the rationalizations actually may have a lot of power behind them. There may be, I think there are there's something to be said for not letting people vote 6 months before voting day. They'll be deprived of information they need. At some level, that we can't run this. It's not a 24-hour drugstore. And there's something to be, voting from home. There's something to be said for participating in collective civic rituals and going to a place to cast the vote. Many of these things can be defended, but there's this mood that says we want to actually stop certain categories of people, and that is driven by the anxieties of people of things to protect.
But isn't that at some level a rejection of conservatism's belief in individual liberty and self-determination?
Well, yes. Individual conservatism believes in those things, and that's why conservatism has been able to make its peace with democracy. And that's an historical fact, too. I mean, that many democratic innovations were driven by conservative-minded people in a way, sometimes in ways that's uncomfortable for modern people to confront. I mean, how much of the energy behind women's suffrage was conservative. That one of the things that advocates of women's suffrage counted on women voters to do was to suppress strikes, out of control drinking. It's not a coincidence that American women got the vote at exactly the same time, not just after the First World War, when the country was cracking down on all kinds of other forms of behavior, especially labor radicalism and alcohol dependency. And the women were mobilized because it was thought they would vote for a more orderly kind of society. And indeed, the huge Republican landslide of 1920 was enabled by the hugely by the gender gap in the Republican favor by women voters.
You write in the book about Trump's response to the demonstrations and counter-demonstrations and violence in Charlottesville, Virginia. And there clearly appear to be white nationalist forces that feel emboldened and take comfort in Donald Trump's rise. It's not a huge focus of the book, but more broadly, what do you see as the role of the alt-right in the Trump presidency and beyond it? Do you think Trump has unleashed something that he really doesn't quite control or understand?
I think that's a good way to put it. Here's one. When you get radical movements, you have to, is this radical movement something that's so marginal that you don't need to deal with it? The Symbionese Liberation Army in the 1970s. Certain extreme animal rights activist groups that, that these are people, they do violent things, and then the answer is, well, you just try to track them down, there won't be more than 40 of them, arrest them for their crimes, remove them from society will be safe. But sometimes you get radical groups that are expressing something real, broadly shared, the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were violent criminals, but they were in radicalized form speaking to something that Black America was not content with the achievements of the first wave of the Civil War. In fact, this had opened the way to a lot of anger and, okay, we can vote, but we want an equal share of the society. At that point, what a wisely stable policy, what a wise conservatism does, is to say, confronting something like the Black Panthers, what we have to do is we have to identify the antisocial personalities here and isolate and marginalize them. And then we have to identify the grievances they're exploiting, and we have to address them. And it's a combination of both repression and concession. That's how you meet radical groups that are broadly based. And that's, I think, my reaction to things like Charlottesville. And one of the reasons why I was Trump curious, but at the same time I'm so Trump horrified. I mean, the alt-right, or whatever you want to call that movement, it's made up of obviously many violent socio and psychopaths, cruel and vicious people. But it's also channeling that something is gone very wrong in the less educated part of white America, that people are killing themselves with drugs. America has the lowest seatbelt use of any developed country. Why? We're less likely to put children in car seats than any other developed country. Why? There's something, people are not finding life precious enough. The addiction, the self-medication with food and video games, and I would say I get in trouble with this with the rise in use of marijuana, which has I think doubled since 2007. Something's going wrong. So and those people end up sometimes sometimes they end up dropping out of society altogether. So the task of creative leadership, and this is one of the reasons why when I speak to my friends on the right, I see Donald Trump as such a tragedy. Well, you can't say, well, there's good and bad. He's achieved things for. What he's doing is he's taking everything that you ought to be working on, and he's corrupted it and putting it to a dead end. The response to the alt-right is, the ones who bear arms, prison. The ones who incite, on the internet, who basically play the part of self-radicalizing jihadi preachers, marginalize them. But those millions of under 30 young men who are earning less than women, don't see marriage in their future, are experimenting with drugs, and are putting themselves on the path to a self-destructive and socially harmful life, they need a bigger answer than being told that they should be ashamed of how much privilege they got.
I want to shift a little bit to the international scene. One of your big concerns in this book is that Trump is eroding America's leadership in the world. And I know it's hard to separate these things, but when you think, what part of Donald Trump's impact do you think will be more lasting? His impact on American democracy at home, or this erosion of global leadership that you chronicle in Trumpocracy?
The erosion of global leadership will certainly be faster to go into effect. It's already happened. I mean, just think, if you're South Korean, and how can you trust the United States? The President of the United States is clearly contemplating a future in which he trades hundreds of thousands of casualties in your country in order to avoid any nuclear risk to his country. At the same time as he's reneging on deals like how you pay for the missile defense of South Korea, and as he's attacking the U.S.-South Korea Free Trade Agreement, which is so essential to your country's prosperity. Meanwhile, he tweets out about once a month that if you want protection from a North Korean nuclear missile, the person to ask for that protection from is the president of China. So South Korea and China, the Korean people in China, they have a history of nationalist conflict, and obviously one's a democracy and one is not. But if you need security and the Chinese can provide it and the United States can't or won't, then you have to talk to China, whether you like it or not. I think that's already in place. And I think that the opening of the border between South Korea and North Korea, which Donald Trump hails as an achievement, is actually a vote against his leadership. That the South Koreans are thinking, we have to make our own deal here because the American guarantee is not trustworthy and not safe. I think you see a lot of this happening on the continent of Europe, where the United States is on the most important thing that has happened in Europe since the adoption of the euro, maybe more important than that, which is negotiating an amicable and stable Brexit. The United States is AWOL. And Trump, for some reason, that Trump has decided that Germany is America's most important geopolitical enemy. And he could not be more hostile. There isn't a U.S. ambassador to Berlin, and the person he's appointed as his nominee is an almost deliberate insult to the German leadership. There's no U.S. ambassador to Brussels, to the European Union headquarters either. And Trump at regulars has something disobliging to say about Germany and about the EU. They're not going to forget this. The biggest jump in math is the jump from 0 to 1, from non-existence to existence. And all of these doubts have jumped into existence.
What will it take for the rest of the world to look to America for leadership in the way that perhaps it once did?
Well, this was going to be a problem for the United States no matter what. The United States, 50% of world economy in 1945, 30% of world economy in the Nixon years, a little over 20% in the Reagan years, is on its way to being about 15% of the world economy. And the United States has been reinforced by the wealth of friends, but if it wanted to exert the kind of power it did in the 1980s, it was going to need to head a big and sustained coalition, and that's always difficult. So maintaining American leadership was going to be a difficult project no matter what. So what it will take, first, enormous economic growth in the United States would help, making the United States a bigger share of the world economy. Bad behavior from America's rivals will help. I mean, that right now China looks to many like not an attractive alternative, but a more predictable alternative than the United States. If China behaves in a way that's unpredictable, that may bring some friends back. But it will take barring those things, a generation of careful, painstaking, tedious work on institutions that were destroyed by people who didn't understand how they worked or why they'd been built.
The origins of this book, in part, are found in this terrific Atlantic cover piece you did a year ago, something along the lines of, how to build an autocracy, right? The timing of that was extraordinary, by the way. I think your editors posted it just as the travel ban was, the first travel ban was going into effect.
Jeff Goldberg's genius. It was supposed to come out a week later, and Jeff Goldberg's our new editor, and he's just one of these people with this preternatural sense for where the public is. And by the way, this was a costly decision because these cover stories are linked to print advertising. And he bit the bullet to say this was an economic risk, to release it early on the internet because this was the moment. And he was, as usual, completely right. But the fact, Jeff is so often completely right that you forget how unusual it is to be right so often, but I was completely right.
In that piece, you put yourself 4 years into the future, imagining the beginning of a second Trump term. And a lot of the things you thought that would be characterizing the country at the time, are things like a sort of compliant GOP Congress, a sort of stigmatized press, a kind of wearily quiescent public.
Right.
I'd like to ask you to cast forward again, now sort of 1 year in to the Trump presidency, based on what you see, and this conflict, this fight that you identify between Trumpocracy and American democracy traditionally defined. Do you see the guardrails holding? How do you see this battle playing out?
I think many of the things I envisioned being true in 2021 did come true, are in the process of coming true. So the fundament is that the Trump years were prosperous. That he ran big deficits, he had loose money, he had immigration restriction policies that tightened the labor market, and he spent a lot on infrastructure. The infrastructure program hasn't materialized yet, but it's not hard to imagine that it will, and that these things then tighten the labor market, especially for blue-collar men, and that people liked it. And one of my predictions is that 2018 may be a better year for Donald Trump than 2017 as wage increases flow through the economy. I did predict a compliant Congress. That depends on outcomes of elections in 2018. I mean, he may have a very frisky Congress, but if the economy is strong in 2018 and wages rise, Republican losses may be less dramatic than most people today are imagining they will be. The cowing of the treatment of the press. I spent a lot of time on Trump's use in that article, on Trump's use of antitrust as a weapon against the press, and that's clearly, as you know, at the Washington Post, that is clearly a top of mind concern for the president, as has been the use of the Time Warner merger to put pressure on CNN. And so far, the elite press has been really resistant, and the Washington Post has played an incredible role. But the larger concern, which is that the article envisioned by the press, is it might be that even the elite press holds, but that it's made ever less relevant in a country where more and more people get soft news via social media. Facebook is making decisions right now that indicate a great willingness to play ball with authoritarian regimes outside the United States. And that sort of augurs ill for what it would do if it were under pressure in the United States. Facebook runs a business model that is tremendously sensitive to government pressure. A very few regulatory changes could, if the government were just to deem Facebook a publisher, responsible. So if somebody defames somebody on Facebook, somebody writes an article in the Washington Post that defames somebody, the Washington Post is liable. If somebody writes that article on Facebook, Facebook is not liable. Why should that be? You can make a pretty strong case. Maybe Facebook should be liable. Maybe Facebook, and if Facebook is liable, then suddenly the number of Facebook's tiny number of employees they'll have to have editors. And then with editors, there vanishes Facebook's enormous profitability. And tiny changes like that, little changes in privacy regulations. The United States would adopt EU-style privacy regulations that would have a huge impact on Facebook's bottom line. It's easy to imagine pressures like that being brought to bear, especially as we get closer to the next presidential election.
David Frum, author of Trumpocracy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for your attention to the book.
C-SPAN, where history unfolds daily. In 1970,